The calm before the storm. A new beginning that turns into a nightmare. Moving into a new home is often seen as a fresh start, a place where you can carve out your own little piece of tranquility. The excitement of unpacking boxes, getting comfortable in a new environment, and finally having a space you can call your own is unlike any other feeling. For most, it represents the culmination of hard work, and for others, it's the beginning of a new chapter in life. When I moved into Oak Estates, a picturesque suburban neighborhood nestled just outside of the city, I was looking forward to peace and quiet. The manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the promise of a friendly community atmosphere seemed like everything I had ever wanted. I imagined long afternoons sipping coffee on the porch, my new neighbors waving as they passed by with their dogs, and an occasional chat with them at the local park. It all seemed so perfect, so serene, so normal. I had left behind a high-pressure career in federal law enforcement, where I spent over 2 decades bringing down organized crime syndicates. After years of chasing criminals, dodging bullets, and working in the trenches of the justice system, I longed for something simpler, a break from the chaos. Oak Estates was supposed to be the escape I had been dreaming of. Little did I know it would turn into a battleground where I would have to fight not just for my rights, but for the peace of an entire community. The first signs of trouble came early. As I was settling in, I began to notice a woman watching me from across the street. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another neighbor curious about the new face in the neighborhood. But as the days went by, it became clear that her interest in me wasn't so innocent. Her name was Sandra Whitmore, and she wasn't just a neighbor. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Now, I had heard of HOAs before. Most people have. They're the governing bodies that set the rules for the community, enforcing codes for everything from lawn maintenance to the color of your house. But I never imagined they could be such a force of control. Sandra's presence was more than just an occasional friendly hello. She was watching my every move, making sure I adhered to her invisible rules. And, as I would soon learn, this HOA president had a very different understanding of community standards. The first time Sandra approached me, it wasn't with a welcoming smile or a simple, hello, neighbor. No, she showed up at my door at 7 a.m. the very next morning, pearl necklace gleaming, clipboard in hand, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as the president of Oak Estates HOA, immediately presenting me with a stack of paperwork, 47 pages of rules, regulations, and astronomical fees. I politely declined, explaining that I wasn't interested in joining the HOA. After all, I had spent the last 23 years prosecuting organized crime, so the idea of giving up control over my property to an unelected body seemed foreign to me. Sandra's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "Everyone joins eventually," she said, her words dripping with the kind of passive-aggressive threat I had heard many times during my career as a prosecutor. She wasn't used to people saying no, and I quickly realized I was in for much more than just an HOA enrollment request. Sandra's reaction wasn't just irritation. It was the beginning of a campaign of subtle but relentless intimidation. That evening, a note appeared on my windshield. The next morning, neighbors who had been so friendly before were suddenly avoiding eye contact. The psychological warfare had begun, and I recognized the familiar tactics immediately. These weren't just small-town annoyances. This was organized pressure, the kind I had spent years fighting against in Chicago's crime rings. The HOA wasn't just a group of neighbors trying to maintain a nice neighborhood. It was a shadow operation, one built on control, fear, and intimidation. As the days wore on, I started noticing patterns. Threats disguised as concerns, passive-aggressive remarks about my property, and strange little comments about my refusal to join the HOA. The more I ignored their tactics, the more intense they became. But what Sandra didn't realize was that she wasn't just dealing with a stubborn homeowner. She was dealing with someone who knew exactly how to break down an organized system of corruption. After decades of prosecuting criminal enterprises, I had developed a keen understanding of how these kinds of operations functioned. What Sandra had created wasn't just an HOA. It was a well-oiled, albeit illegal, crime syndicate. The first hint that things were more than just petty neighborhood drama came from Bill Henderson, a neighbor who nervously shared his own story of how the Thompsons, the previous family that had lived in my house, had been driven out. He warned me that Sandra had connections in local government and even the police. His eyes darted nervously as he told me about the bullying tactics, vandalized cars, sick pets, and social isolation. As he spoke, I realized this wasn't just about property values and neighborhood rules. This was about control, about driving people out who didn't fit into Sandra's idea of the perfect neighborhood. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I wasn't just a homeowner looking for peace. I was a federal prosecutor who had spent his career dismantling criminal organizations. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. This was a case waiting to be made. The next few days were crucial. I began setting up surveillance on my property, both visible and hidden cameras, knowing that I needed hard evidence to take Sandra down. At first, the footage was mundane. Sandra measuring my lawn, taking photos of my mailbox. But soon, things escalated. One night, I caught her in the act, pouring gasoline over my car. My heart raced as I watched her light a match and walk away with satisfaction as flames consumed my sedan. This wasn't just harassment. This was felony-level arson, and it was the perfect piece of evidence I needed to bring Sandra and her criminal network to justice. As I reported the crime and prepared to take action, I realized how deeply embedded Sandra's control was within the neighborhood. She had created a web of fear, manipulation, and deceit. The community was paralyzed, too terrified to stand up to her. But I wasn't just any victim. I had the tools, the experience, and the connections to fight back. This wasn't just about reclaiming my car. It was about reclaiming the entire community from an organized criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association. The intimidation campaign, the web tightens. Once the initial shock of my car being set on fire wore off, the real work began. The flames were not just an attack on my property. They were a clear signal that Sandra had underestimated me. She thought she could intimidate me into submission, just as she had done with so many others in Oak Estates. But Sandra didn't realize she was up against someone who had spent decades facing down far worse threats than a petty HOA president. As the days passed, I found myself becoming increasingly entrenched in what was clearly a war of attrition. At first, Sandra and her team of board members tried to push me with subtle tactics, notes, unwanted inspections, and random complaints. But as the days wore on, they began to escalate, and the gloves came off. Sandra, once the calm and collected neighborhood leader, now was a woman who had put all her chips into one basket: coercion and fear. I continued my daily routine of monitoring the neighborhood, but now with a more focused eye. I started documenting every violation of HOA codes at the board members' properties: fences too high, lights left on past curfew, and flower beds that clearly violated the rules Sandra had laid down. The hypocrisy was staggering. But more importantly, it gave me ammunition for a much larger case. I wasn't just going to fight back with words. I was going to use the one thing Sandra clearly didn't have: a clean, unassailable case. Every violation I documented, every photo I snapped, every piece of evidence I collected added another layer of protection around me. Sandra was used to being the one in control, but she was now in my sights. The more she pushed, the more evidence I gathered. And what I uncovered was deeply disturbing. One morning, while walking through the neighborhood, I noticed Jim Baker, one of Sandra's loyal board members, talking to several other residents, his voice low and tense. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, a telltale sign that something was amiss. When I invited him over for coffee, his posture was defensive, and his eyes kept darting nervously. He wasn't just trying to help. He was afraid. Through our conversation, it became clear that Sandra had an extensive web of control over Oak Estates. Bill, my neighbor from down the street, had warned me that the Thompsons were forced out after their kids' bikes were vandalized. Their dog mysteriously got sick, and finally, they simply disappeared from the neighborhood. Bill's story mirrored the kind of tactics that organized crime families use to intimidate and control people. Fear was Sandra's weapon, and she wielded it with precision. "Look," Jim said, his voice cracking. "Sandra runs a tight ship. Things go smoothly when everyone follows the rules. But those who don't, they get the message." He had no idea that his admission was exactly what I needed. I had been documenting their tactics all along, but this conversation, captured on my phone through a discreet recording, was invaluable. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was building a case, and Sandra was providing all the evidence I needed. Her system of threats, intimidation, and fear wasn't just illegal. It was a criminal operation disguised as neighborhood governance. "I think you said exactly what needed to be said," I told Jim, revealing the recording, his face drained of color. "You're now protected by something more powerful than Sandra: federal law." Jim left my house visibly shaken, but I knew the tide was turning. Sandra had been playing a dangerous game, thinking she could intimidate anyone who didn't comply with her vision of the perfect neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that she had just crossed paths with someone who knew how to dismantle such an operation. Piece by piece, I immediately began setting up more extensive surveillance on my property. Visible cameras as a deterrent, hidden ones to gather evidence. I wasn't playing around anymore. I was going to take Sandra down. The first breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. one morning. My phone buzzed with an alert, and when I checked the screen, it was Sandra, dressed in black clothing, measuring my grass with a ruler and photographing my mailbox. She was trespassing. I recorded the footage and began building my case file. But Sandra didn't stop there. She made the fatal mistake of underestimating me. The more I watched, the more I realized that the HOA board wasn't just enforcing rules. They were running a systematic operation of control, intimidation, and extortion. I didn't have to look far for more evidence. Each morning, I took walks around the neighborhood, photographing violations at board members' homes. Jim Baker's fence? Too tall. Helen Porter's garden gnomes? Unapproved. Sandra's own porch lights were illegal. It was blatant, and I documented it all. I also ran background checks through my former colleagues at the FBI, uncovering Sandra's sealed embezzlement conviction from her time in Florida. This wasn't just a woman who wanted to run a neighborhood. This was someone who had a history of criminal activity. Soon, I found a smoking gun. Sandra had a storage unit rented under her maiden name, and the HOA's maintenance worker was making regular trips there. Using my skills, I tracked him and followed him to the facility, where I planted a small tracking device on his vehicle. The next day, I showed up with a warrant, one granted by a judge who owed me a favor, and what I found inside was chilling. Files on every resident who had ever questioned Sandra's authority. Personal photographs, financial records, detailed strategies on how to eliminate dissenters. The evidence was overwhelming. Sandra wasn't just running an HOA. She was running a criminal enterprise. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a section labeled Elimination Successes, where Sandra had documented families she had forced out of the neighborhood. The most telling evidence was a series of photos of moving trucks, taken after residents had been intimidated and forced out. There were also recordings of these families in distress. This was systematic, and it was being orchestrated by Sandra and her hand-picked board members. With this treasure trove of evidence, I was ready to make my move. I contacted the FBI and set the wheels in motion for a nationwide takedown of Sandra's operation. I had the evidence, the connections, and the determination to end Sandra's reign of terror once and for all. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Sandra's response was predictably desperate. She escalated the intimidation tactics, starting with small inconveniences. My water was mysteriously shut off, my mail was tampered with, and I found dead birds arranged on my welcome mat. These were petty attempts at social isolation, but they only served to fuel my resolve. I had seen worse tactics during my time prosecuting criminal organizations, and I wasn't going to let Sandra break me. Her latest move was to publish an article in the HOA's newsletter, subtly attacking me and other residents who refused to join the HOA. The article implied criminal activity at my address, painting me as a troublemaker. But Sandra underestimated the power of a federal prosecutor. It was time to take the gloves off. The final countdown, bringing down the HOA tyrants. The war between Sandra and me had escalated far beyond simple neighborhood politics. It was now a battle of survival. I wasn't just fighting for my rights anymore. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood, for the people who had been living in fear for far too long. The weight of the evidence I had collected, surveillance footage, personal testimonies, financial records, was overwhelming. But I needed one final piece to make my case irrefutable. And that piece came at the most unexpected time. I had gathered everything I needed to dismantle Sandra's criminal enterprise, but the final straw came when I witnessed her blatant disregard for the law in real time. It was 3:07 a.m. when I was jolted out of my sleep by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The security lights around my property illuminated the scene. There was Sandra, face calm and smug as ever, pouring gasoline over the hood of my car. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and activated the emergency recording protocol on all my cameras. Sandra wasn't even trying to hide anymore. She lit a match and, in front of the cameras and the open street, watched my car go up in flames. The acrid smell of gasoline filled the air as the fire spread. It was a clear act of arson, and Sandra was standing there, crossing her arms, as if she was above reproach. She watched the fire with a sense of satisfaction, thinking that this would be the moment that would break me. But she was wrong. I immediately called 911, clearly identifying Sandra Whitmore as the perpetrator. When the fire department arrived, I played the role of a shocked victim to perfection, doing my best to appear bewildered and confused. Sandra, on the other hand, acted as though she was completely untouchable. As the fire department and 2 officers arrived, I tried to show them the footage I had, but they insisted it needed to be processed through proper channels. The police officers, whom I recognized as being on Sandra's payroll, dismissed my evidence, offering no help at all. Sandra, however, made a mistake. As she whispered to me while the officers were still on the scene, she threatened me in front of witnesses. "Next time, it might not just be your car," she said with a cold smile. "Some accidents happen inside homes." She didn't realize it then, but this was the final piece of evidence I needed to bring her down for good. As the officers left, I stayed calm, letting Sandra believe that she had won. But I knew the real game was just beginning. With my experience in organized crime investigations, I knew exactly how to proceed. I immediately transmitted the surveillance footage to my former colleague Jessica Ramirez, who was now working with the FBI's white-collar crime division. Within an hour, she called me back. "Mark," she said, her voice serious, "this is textbook racketeering with bonus arson. We've got jurisdiction the second she used fire. I need this done by the book. We'll hit them hard." Within hours, Jessica had obtained federal warrants, and the plans for synchronized raids were set in motion. The following morning, as the first light of dawn broke over Oak Estates, 7 locations were raided, including Sandra's home, the HOA office, and the storage unit where I had previously uncovered all the incriminating files. I stayed out of sight, maintaining my cover as just another victim in Sandra's grand scheme. The raids were swift and methodical. When the FBI agents breached Sandra's front door, she was still in her bathrobe, clearly shocked and completely unprepared. Her expression of smug entitlement collapsed when they presented the federal warrants. They recovered evidence beyond what I had hoped for: financial records, spreadsheets, and photographs showing that Sandra had been embezzling HOA funds, laundering money through shell companies, and even bribing local officials. The evidence of racketeering was overwhelming. But the real kicker came when they discovered something truly chilling. In Sandra's garage, hidden behind holiday decorations, were gasoline-soaked clothing matching what she had worn the night of the arson. She hadn't even bothered to get rid of the clothes she wore to destroy my car. It was clear that she thought she was above the law, and that mistake would cost her everything. Once all the evidence was secured, I finally revealed my true identity to Sandra, stepping out of the shadows and showing her the badge that marked me as a federal prosecutor. The shock on her face was priceless as I introduced myself calmly: Federal Prosecutor Mark Carter, Organized Crime Division. Sandra, in a final desperate bid to salvage her reputation, tried to spin the situation in her favor. "This is absurd," she shouted. "I'm the victim here. This man refused to comply with community standards." I responded without missing a beat. Community standards don't typically include arson, extortion, mail fraud, and racketeering. We've documented at least 37 federal violations so far. Sandra's composure shattered. Her smugness gave way to panic. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "I have connections. This neighborhood needs me." I looked at her, calm and unwavering. "What this neighborhood needs is justice, and I'm here to deliver it." As the FBI agents led Sandra away in handcuffs, the neighborhood stood still in shock. The reign of terror that had been forced upon them for so many years was finally over. Sandra's corruption had been exposed, and the truth had come to light. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom scene was a fitting end to Sandra's story. As she stood before the judge, her arrogance had crumbled entirely. The FBI had gathered an airtight case against her, and the prosecution, led by my colleague Jessica Ramirez, was relentless. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Financial audits showing over $1.2 million in misappropriated funds, recorded threats, and the surveillance footage of the arson. The jury didn't need much convincing. Sandra's defense team tried desperately to claim that she was just enforcing community standards. But when the video of her pouring gasoline on my car and watching it burn played in court, their arguments fell apart. Former residents came forward, sharing their stories of how they had been forced out of the neighborhood through intimidation and fear. The Johnsons, the Patels, the Wilsons, all families who had been driven out of Oak Estates, told their stories of harassment and mistreatment at Sandra's hands. The jury was appalled. The final blow came when Helen Porter, a former board member, testified against Sandra, revealing the elaborate system of coercion Sandra had put in place. She admitted to keeping a list of families to eliminate in order to maintain control over the neighborhood. She even provided the court with photos of moving trucks and the profits Sandra had made by forcing families to sell their homes under duress. Sandra's defense collapsed completely, and when I took the stand, I methodically outlined how her operation mirrored the tactics used by organized crime syndicates. The jury needed no further evidence. The verdict was swift and undeniable. Sandra was guilty of racketeering, arson, extortion, and several other criminal charges. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional sentences for fraud and obstruction of justice. The rest of the HOA board members were sentenced to between 5 and 12 years. As Sandra was led away in handcuffs, she muttered under her breath, "I should have checked who you were before burning your car." I simply nodded. "You really should have." The community reborn. The transformation of Oak Estates was nothing short of miraculous. Once the corrupt HOA regime was dismantled, the neighborhood began to heal. For the first time in years, people felt safe. No more threats, no more intimidation, just neighbors coming together to rebuild what had been torn apart. The first neighborhood meeting after Sandra's conviction was held on my front lawn, and it was the first time in years that the community felt truly united. There were no mandatory attendance rules, no threats, just neighbors coming together voluntarily to discuss how they could help each other. We replaced Sandra's pretentious Oak Ridge Estates monument with a community garden, a place where neighbors could grow food together, symbolizing a return to real community values. We established a new, simple covenant based on mutual respect rather than control. And as I looked around at the smiling faces, the children playing freely, and the conversations happening without fear, I realized that the greatest victory was not the conviction of Sandra. It was the reclamation of the community. Oak Estates was no longer a place of fear. It was a place where people could live together in peace. This story is a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how entrenched the opposition may seem. It demonstrates the strength of determination, the impact of knowledge, and the significance of using the law to fight against abuse and corruption. Here are the key lessons we can take away from this inspiring journey. 1. Power of persistence and patience. The protagonist's ability to remain calm and composed, despite relentless intimidation and threats, is a powerful example of the importance of patience and persistence. Standing up to corruption takes time, and it often involves enduring significant pressure. But just like in this case, persistence pays off when you remain committed to the cause. 2. Using the law as a tool for justice. As someone with extensive experience in law enforcement, The protagonist used his expertise to dismantle a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association. This highlights the importance of using legal knowledge to challenge abusive systems, ensuring that the perpetrators are held accountable and protecting others from future harm. 3. The strength of community. The story not only revolves around the protagonist's individual fight, but also the transformation of an entire community. Once the corruption was exposed, the residents of Oak Estates came together, rebuilding trust and creating a safer, more supportive environment. This shows that when individuals unite against wrongdoing, they can make a significant impact, improving the lives of everyone involved. 4. Don't let fear control you. The story reminds us that fear can be one of the most effective tools used by those in power to maintain control. Sandra used fear to manipulate the residents of Oak Estates, but by standing firm and not allowing fear to dictate their actions, the protagonist and his neighbors were able to break free from her grip. 5. The power of evidence. In a world where truth is often obscured, gathering evidence and keeping detailed records can be the key to exposing corruption and injustice. The protagonist's methodical collection of evidence, including hidden surveillance footage and testimonies, played a crucial role in taking down the corrupt HOA board. This teaches us that thorough documentation can make all the difference when challenging abuse of power. Call to action. If you found this story inspiring, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content that empowers individuals to fight back against injustice. This story isn't just a tale of personal victory. It's a call to action for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of tyranny. When we stand up for ourselves and our communities, we can make the world a better place for everyone. Let's spread this message far and wide, because together, we can challenge corruption, build stronger communities, and ensure that justice is always served. Thank you for watching, and remember, never back down from what's right, no matter the odds.